Now turn to Section 1. Section 1. You will hear a man asking for information about health services in the place where he is living. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 6. Now we shall begin. You should answer the questions as you listen, because you will not hear the recording a second time. Listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 6.
Can I help you?
Yes, I've just moved to this area with my wife and children, and I'd like to know where we can all register with a doctor at a health centre.
Oh, OK. Well, there's Dr. Green at the Harvey Clinic. We always recommend her for babies because she's very good with them and she runs a special clinic.
Oh, actually, my youngest child is 5, so that wouldn't be any good for us.
Right.
Is there anywhere else I could try?
Yes, the Eshcol Health Practice is the next one on my list.
How do you spell that?
Eshcol. And it's Dr. Fuller who has space on his list. The clinic only opened a year ago, so the facilities are all very modern.
That sounds good.
And it's particularly good if you're busy during the day because they also do appointments in the evening. They're closed on Saturday, though. The only other place on the list is the health centre on Shore Lane. You can register with Dr. Gormley. That's Gormley. He's new there, but the centre has a very good reputation.
Oh, yes. I think I know the road. That would be the best one. Thanks. Could you tell me, will all their services be free?
There are usually some small charges that doctors make. Let me see what it says about the Shore Lane Centre. If you need to be vaccinated before any trips abroad, you won't have to pay for this. What else? The Sports Injury Treatment Service operates on a paying basis, as does the Nutritional Therapy Service. Some health centres do offer alternative therapies like homeopathy as part of their pay-to-use service. Shore Lane are hoping to do this soon. I think they may start with acupuncture.
Oh.
And finally, if you need to prove you're healthy or haven't had any serious injuries before a new employer will accept you, you can get a free fitness check-up there. But you'd most likely have to pay for insurance medicals, though.
OK, thanks.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 7 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 7 to 10.
You might also be interested to know the centre is running a pilot scheme of talks for patients. I've got the list here. Actually, they look very interesting.
What sort of things?
Well, the first one's about giving up smoking. It's next week, the 25th of February at 7 p.m, and that's in room 4. It says the talk will stress the health benefits, particularly for people with asthma or heart disease.
That sounds very interesting.
There's also a talk for families with children. It's on healthy eating and takes place on the 1st of March at 5 o'clock.
Will that be at the health centre?
Actually, it's at the primary school on Shore Lane. I imagine they're inviting the parents of pupils there. It says here, all welcome.
I might go to that if I have time.
There's a couple of other talks. One giving advice about how to avoid injuries while doing exercise. It's on the 9th of March. Oh, it's a late afternoon talk at 4:30. And it'll be in room 6. It also says the talk is suitable for all ages. And finally, there's a talk called Stress Management, which is on the...
That is the end of section 1. You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turn to Section 2. Section 2. You'll hear a guide talking to a group of tourists about Buckingham Palace. First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 17. Now listen carefully and answer questions 11 to 17.
Now, of course, Buckingham Palace is instantly recognisable to millions of people around the world. As we pass the palace, I'd like to tell you a few things about the history of this famous building. We think the first house was built here around 1624. In 1674, that house burned down and a new one was built, called Arlington House after its owner, the first Earl of Arlington. Then, in 1703, the first Duke of Buckingham changed the design of the house and the name. It was then known as Buckingham House. The building we see in front of us now has undergone many changes since it was first built. The east front, which is the part we see from the road, was added as part of the work done by Queen Victoria and was completed in 1850. But the palace has remained pretty much unchanged for nearly 100 years. The last major changes to the structure were made by King George V, who, in 1913, had the east front redesigned as a backdrop to the large memorial to Queen Victoria, which had just been placed outside the palace gates. Since then, only minor changes have been made. I should point out, though, that the palace was bombed 7 times during the Second World War, most seriously in 1940, when the palace's chapel was destroyed. Today, of course, it is the home of the royal family, but that wasn't always the case, although they did own most of the land it was built on. It was George IV who turned it into a palace, doubling its size when he became king in 1820. He had inherited it from his father, King George III, who, in 1761, had become the first royal owner of the building, though it was still not used as the home of the royal family, just as a private home for Queen Charlotte. It was known as the Queen's House at that time. King William IV finished the work after his brother, George IV, died. But King William never moved into the palace. In fact, in 1834, he offered it as a new home for Parliament after the Houses of Parliament were destroyed by fire. The offer was not accepted, though, and in 1837, when Victoria became Queen, the house became the main royal residence in London. However, Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert, found the house too small, so they carried out building work to further enlarge it. This included building the east front, which I've already mentioned as the part we are looking at now. Victoria was also responsible for moving the Marble Arch, built as a part of the palace itself in the 1820s, to where it stands today, separate from the palace on the corner of Hyde Park. For 20 years or so, the palace was often the setting for huge banquets, dances, and musical performances. This period lasted until Prince Albert died in 1861, after which Victoria spent very little time there, and the palace was hardly ever used.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 18 to 20. Now listen and answer questions 18 to 20.
When Victoria died in 1901, Edward VII became king. He was responsible for most of the decoration inside that exists today, and the dark days of the later part of Victoria's reign were fairly quickly forgotten as the palace came back to life. The palace has been in continual use by the British royal family ever since. A lot of people ask me if they can visit the palace. One way is if you're lucky enough to be invited to one of the 3 garden parties usually held every year. As many as 8,000 people attend these, although most of them do not get to meet any members of the royal family, and they don't see much of the inside of the palace. The garden is, however, quite spectacular, and it is the largest private garden in London, with an artificial lake, 30 different species of bird, and over 350 different wild flowers, some of which are extremely rare. Inside the palace, there are 240 bedrooms, 92 offices, and 78 bathrooms. There are also 19 staterooms, which are used for official engagements and ceremonies. Members of the public are only allowed to visit the staterooms, and then only in August or September when the monarch is not there. It's worth it, though, because there's a lot to see in the staterooms, including examples of some of the world's best art with works by Rembrandt, Rubens, and Canaletto. The tour, which lasts up to 2.5 hours, ends in the garden, where you can see more of the outside of the palace not visible from the road.
That is the end of section 2. You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turn to section 3. Section 3. You will hear a conversation between an English teacher called Paul and a former student of his called Kira. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 25. Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 25.
Hello, Kira. How are you?
Fine, thanks, Paul. How are you?
Well, thanks. It's good to see you. It must be 12 months since you did our course.
That's right. It's nice to come back and say hello.
What course did you enroll in?
Actually, I went straight into third-year pharmacy. They credited me with 2 years, which probably made it more difficult for me.
On the other hand, you were lucky to be granted credits. Is that why you chose the course?
Yes, and as I'd already finished a course in it in my country, I thought it would be easier if I studied something I already knew.
I didn't realize you went into 3rd year. I thought you started in 1st year. No wonder it was so hard. And what do you think is one of the big differences between studying at a university here and studying in your country?
Well, I found it very difficult to write assignments because I wasn't familiar with that aspect of the system here. The main problem is that the lectures expect you to be critical. That made me feel really terrible. I thought, how can I possibly do it? How can I comment on someone else's research when they probably spent 5 years doing it? I think a lot of people who come from overseas countries have similar problems. But after a while, it became easier for me. People expect you to have problems with the process of reading and writing, but in fact, it is more a question of altering your viewpoint towards academic study.
How was the content of the lectures? Was it easy for you?
I didn't really have many problems understanding lectures. The content was very similar to what I'd studied before.
And what about the lecturers themselves? Are they essentially the same as lecturers in your country?
Well, actually, no. Here they're much easier to approach. After every lecture, you can go and ask them something you didn't understand, or you can make an appointment and talk to them about anything in the course.
Maybe you found them different because you're a more mature student now, whereas when you were studying in your country, you were younger and not so assertive.
No, I don't think that's the difference. Most of the students here do it. In my faculty, they all seem to make appointments, usually to talk about something in the course that's worrying them, but sometimes just about something that might really interest them, something they might want to specialize in. The lecturers must set aside certain times every week when they're available for students.
That's good to hear.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 26 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 26 to 30.
And how was your timetable? Was it a very busy year?
Oh, very, very busy. They make you work very hard. Apart from lectures, we had practical sessions in a lot of subjects. We did these in small groups. I had to go and work 4 hours every week in a community pharmacy. Actually, I enjoyed this very much, meeting new people all the time. Then in second semester, we had to get experience in hospital dispensaries. So every second day we went to one of the big hospitals and worked there. And on top of all that, we had our assignments, which took me a lot of time. Oh, I nearly forgot. Between first and second semesters, we had to work full-time for 2 weeks in a hospital.
That does sound a very heavy year. So, are you pleased now that you did it? Do you feel some sense of achievement?
Yeah, I do feel much more confident, which I suppose is the most important thing.
And have you got any recommendations for people who are studying from overseas?
Well, I suppose they need very good English. It would be much better if they spent more time learning English before they enter the university, because you can be in big trouble if you don't understand what people are saying and you haven't got time to translate.
Anything else?
Well, as I said before, the biggest problem for me was lack of familiarity with the education system here.
It sounds as if it was a real challenge. Congratulations, Kira.
Thanks, Paul.
That is the end of section 3. You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turn to Section 4. Section 4. You'll hear a lecturer talking to students about America in the 1960s. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 37. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 37.
We begin our examination of America in the 1960s with the usual caution. There is no sense in trying to understand any decade without looking at what came before. Those of you who still have outstanding coursework on the 1950s would do well to complete it now, if for no other reason than it will help make sense of the next series of lectures. But we must press on, and I'd like to begin my talk about the 60s with a reference to one of those things that came before, the post-war baby boom. With the end of the Second World War in 1945, there began in the USA an era of perceived prosperity and security. In short, people started to feel that the world was a much better and safer place to bring up children. So, at the start of the 60s, all those children born in the baby boom, 70 million in the US alone, were teenagers. As the 60s progressed, and as this large number of people approached adulthood, there was a noticeable shift in the balance of power, and young people began to have a voice in ways that were not considered possible in the more conservative atmosphere of the preceding decade. Things were moving forward at a rapid pace. The literature of the time brought out all the taboos. Everything was covered, such as race, in, for example, the book To Kill a Mockingbird. The role of women changed, and equality for women, well, let's just say that once certain books were published, women were no longer going to be satisfied with their roles as devoted wives and mothers. Through literature alone, the whole fabric of society was challenged, and by the end of the 60s, things would never again be as they had pretty much been for the preceding 40 years. It was a decade of protest, civil rights protests, feminism, the rights of minorities, the Vietnam War. All these causes led to peaceful and not so peaceful protests on college campuses and elsewhere. People had been given freedom of speech and they were going to use it. The crime rate rose to 9 times what it was in the 50s, as respect for the old order faded away. But it was also a time of great development. In medicine, the 60s saw the first heart transplant. In technology and the space race, where we saw the first American in orbit and lasers being invented at the start of the decade, and the first man on the moon, and the first primitive internet at the end.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 38 to 40. Now listen and answer questions 38 to 40.
None of this, good or bad, might have happened if things in 1962 had gone slightly differently. On October 16th, President John F. Kennedy met with his closest advisors at the White House. They had obtained photographic evidence showing that Cuba was building or installing nuclear weapons. It was widely believed that Cuba was preparing to fire these weapons at cities in the USA. Kennedy was faced with 3 choices: to try to resolve the crisis diplomatically by negotiating with Cuba and the Soviet Union, to take action to block the delivery of more weapons into Cuba, or to attack Cuba, destroying their weapons. Believing that the first option would end in failure and that the third option would lead to war, it was the second option that Kennedy chose. In doing so, he succeeded in preventing the buildup of more missiles. The Soviet Union then withdrew the weapons from Cuba. Most historians agree that if Kennedy had acted differently, the episode would have led to a full-scale nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Millions would have died, and the world would have been changed beyond recognition.
That is the end of section 4. You now have half a minute to check your answers.